They've been called the worst tanks of World War II. Italian armour, infamous for their paper-thin protection, small cannons and machine gun pop guns thrown across desert sands only to become easy prey for Allied guns. But is this the whole story? Why do Italian tanks have such a terrible reputation, notoriously underarmed with poor armour and seemingly doomed from the start? Through extensive research, I've come to understand that the reasons behind Italy's armoured failures are far more complex and nuanced than popular history suggests. It's not just a tale of flawed machines, but a tangled web of leadership challenges, strategic missteps in doctrine, industrial limitations, and resource scarcity. Each factor interwove to shape the fate of Italian tanks on the battlefield, painting a much richer and more complicated picture than the common narrative of outright incompetence. In this video, we'll reveal the real reasons behind Italy's armoured failures. You'll discover it wasn't just about bad blueprints. Leadership decisions, flawed doctrine, an underpowered industrial base, a duopoly hindering innovation and production, and crippling resource shortages all played crucial roles in the downfall of Italian tanks. We'll explore how each factor shaped the battlefield and why even the bravest crews and cleverest engineers couldn't turn the tide. Let's uncover the truth behind the myth of Italian tank incompetence and reveal how much more there is behind their poor reputation than meets the eye. When we examine why Italian tanks and the military as a whole stumbled so badly in World War II, we cannot ignore the role of Benito Mussolini's leadership. His impatience and political ambitions pushed Italy into a war it was gravely unprepared for. Despite clear warnings from his own military advisors about glaring logistical and equipment deficiencies, Mussolini chose to enter World War II in 1940 and launched aggressive campaigns in Africa almost immediately. The result? Early, devastating setbacks that no tank design alone could have overcome. There is evidence of concerns in written letters from the Chief of Staff during the outbreak of the war. Firstly, General Pariani, who retired from the position in 1939, and his replacement, Rodolfo Graziani, in 1940. Both were in favour of mechanisation and the development of armoured doctrine, formalised in 1938 by Pariani. Both identified limitations of the tanks in development during the outbreak of the war. Production of the first medium tank, the M1139, would cease quickly, scrapping the rest of the order for the tanks. Pariani submitted reports to Mussolini that the army was not ready for a war in North Africa. It is most likely he had no choice but to resign. He was blamed for the army not being ready. Concerns for the replacement, the M1340 medium tank, became evident to the new Chief of Staff, Graziani. Graziani did not stay in the position for long, as he would take command of the 10th Army in North Africa. He must have known already that his army were not well equipped for the battles that were to come. What made matters worse in the build-up to the war was Mussolini's emphasis on political loyalty over military competence. That meant that many officers at all levels were selected not for skill or experience, but for their allegiance to fascism. The Regio Esercito was a conservative monarchist army, traditionally recruiting officers from a monarchist background. Mussolini would favour the recruitment of officers who identified with fascism. He even created a parallel fascist military structure, notably the Black Shirts. This favouritism led to an army commanded by subpar leadership, unable to adapt to rapidly changing battle conditions or effectively coordinate complex operations. Even Graziani, Mussolini's loyal enforcer, demonstrated incompetence later during the events of Operation Compass in North Africa. This included Black Shirt divisions under his command as part of the 10th Army at the time. Mussolini's flawed vision extended to economics as well. Obsessed with national self-sufficiency, or otherwise known as autarky, he deliberately avoided dependence on foreign suppliers. While this ideology aimed to make Italy independent and strong, the reality was starkly different. Chronic shortages of essential war materials like coal and iron ore to make modern steel severely hampered Italy's ability to produce advanced tanks and other weaponry. In terms of strategic materials, in 1940, Italy could not match the high numbers of coal, iron ore, crude oil and steel produced by nations such as Great Britain and Germany. Just to put this in perspective, David Willey at the Bovington Tank Museum produced this brilliant presentation on the amount of raw materials produced by Italy compared to Britain and Germany in 1940. These figures have been published on other sources too. Italy produced 4.4 million tonnes of coal compared to Britain with 224 million tonnes and Germany with 364 million tonnes. For crude oil and iron ore, again, Italy produces just a fraction of what the other nations produced. Most raw material needs could be fulfilled only through importation, and no effort was made to stockpile key materials before the entry into war. Mussolini's leadership was marked by a dangerous combination of impatience, misplaced priorities, and economic isolation. Factors that intertwined disastrously to weaken Italian armoured forces before they even reached the deserts of North Africa. Mussolini must have victory, but at what cost? While Mussolini's impatience and flawed leadership critically weakened Italy's armoured forces, another significant factor was his strategic prioritisation of air power and the navy over the army and mechanised units. Mussolini was fixated on asserting Italy's dominance over the Mediterranean Sea, what he called Mare Nostrum, Latin for our sea, and believed that control of the seas and skies was key to Italy's imperial ambitions. This obsession led to a heavy emphasis on building up the Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, and the Regia Aeronautica Air Force, both of which received priority in funding, resources, and modern equipment. Mussolini famously viewed the Navy as the ultimate symbol of national power and spent considerable sums on battleships, cruisers, and submarines designed to challenge British naval dominance. Despite this considerable investment by Mussolini, Britain still controlled a significant proportion of the Mediterranean Sea. This would have dire consequences for the logistical support of armoured and infantry divisions during the North African campaign. Meanwhile, the army, especially its armoured and mechanised branches, suffered chronic neglect. Italian tank production was hampered by inadequate industrial capacity and a shortage of modern materials. But these problems were exacerbated by Mussolini's reluctance to divert resources from the Navy and Air Force. Tanks remained lightly armoured and underarmed, reflecting both technical limitations and the lack of political support compared to the glamorous naval and air units. In effect, Mussolini's grand vision of Mediterranean naval and air supremacy came at the expense of the ground forces that would face the harsh realities of mechanised warfare. This strategic imbalance left Italian armour ill-equipped and ill-prepared, contributing to the failures that would become all too apparent on the battlefields of North Africa and beyond. Mussolini's propaganda played a crucial but often detrimental role in shaping Italy's military approach during World War II. His regime relentlessly cultivated a grand image of invincibility and destined victory through media, art and public messaging, fostering national pride and support for fascism. Benito Mussolini deliberately cultivated and maintained his image as Il Duce, which is Latin for the leader. He used this title throughout his rule. He built an elaborate cult of personality around himself, projecting an image of strength, invincibility, and destined greatness. Propaganda consistently depicted him in heroic and powerful poses, riding horses, flying planes, or engaging in vigorous labour, emphasising macho and almost godlike traits. The regime crafted the narrative that Il Duce was always right and the embodiment of Italy's national destiny. This careful image management was not just superficial, it was a central pillar of his control over Italy, compelling loyalty and conformity among the population and suppressing dissent. The facade of strength and infallibility was so important that admitting military or political failures risked undermining this cultivated persona, and thus was often avoided or disguised. However, this constant pressure to project strength and success frequently obscured the harsh realities faced by the armed forces. Propaganda glorified naval and air power achievements while downplaying or ignoring the severe shortcomings of the army and armoured units. As a result, military and industrial leaders were often pushed to prioritise politically favoured projects, such as battleships and aircraft, over the essential development and modernisation of tanks and mechanised forces. Mussolini's insistence on maintaining an image of flawless leadership bred a culture where admitting weaknesses or failure was politically unacceptable. This environment hindered honest internal assessments and constructive criticism needed for military reforms. The fear of embarrassment or undermining the fascist image led to neglect in critical areas of the army, especially armoured vehicle production and logistics. In this way, propaganda served not only as a tool of mass mobilisation, but also as an obstacle to realistic planning and adaptation, exacerbating the challenges Italian tanks and forces faced on the battlefield. This dynamic reveals how Mussolini's use of propaganda, while politically powerful, indirectly contributed to the military's operational failures by distorting priorities and masking critical deficiencies. It is fair to say that the adoption of mechanisation and mobilisation took its time within the Regio Esercito. The first deployment of tanks was all the way back in the 1920s, when the first Fiat 3000s were deployed in Africa. These were the early days for the development of armoured doctrine. Colonel Enrico Maltese, chief of the tank detachment around the time, was the first to formulate ideas. His ideas recognised the requirement for a highly mobile force with vehicles used for reconnaissance and initial assaults. However, these ideas were met with resistance from other Italian military leaders at the time, who thought that infantry and artillery were more important. Tanks were viewed as something as a support vehicle and not central to battlefield operations. During the early 1930s, Rodolfo Graziani, by now Vice-Governor of Cyrenaica, commanded units of Fiat 3000s, along with infantry and artillery. Graziani led offensive tank forces, leading attacks rather than deployed in defensive positions. The tactical manoeuvres worked well in suppressing the rebels in Libya. It was around the 1930s that military leaders of the Regio Esercito recognised an armoured doctrine favoured by the Germans: combined arms. This was later to be part of the Blitzkrieg, a concentration of armour, motorisation and mechanised infantry for a fast and decisive victory. In 1934, Colonel Sebastiano Visconti Prasca published La Guerra Decisiva, The Decisive War. This publication called for armoured units aided by artillery and air power to punch through the enemy lines, followed by infantry and cavalry units to exploit the gaps. Giovanni Messe was another prominent figure supporting the idea for mechanisation. Messe was recognised for his modern approach to warfare and later commanded Italian mechanised and armoured units. He built a strong reputation commanding the Celera divisions used for fast mobilisation during the Eastern African campaign during the mid-1930s. He would go on to command the Italian Expedition Corps in Russia in 1941, achieving notable victories. However, there was still doubt and a lack of confidence in motorisation and mechanisation from Italian military leadership. This was detrimental to the development of a viable armoured doctrine. An example of this reluctance to change the doctrine occurred in 1937. General Carlo di Simone advocated for mechanised infantry transported by truck and the support of artillery, but still would not call for the creation of an armoured division. Up until 1936, the focus was to build fast light tanks. These were adequate in suppressing rebels in North Africa and manoeuvring in mountainous terrain, but hopeless in tank versus tank combat. The Regio Esercito quickly realised after the conflicts in Ethiopia, followed by the Spanish Civil War, where the L3 tankettes performed poorly against Soviet tanks, that a more powerful tank was required. However, the fast tankettes were ideal for Italy's lack of resources, such as iron and steel. Tankettes could be produced cheaply and in high numbers. It is at this point that doctrine had to change, and heavier tanks were required to equip the army with something that could combat enemy armour. It wasn't until 1938 that reforms were made to the armoured doctrine, formalised by Chief of Staff at the time, Alberto Pariani. This doctrine was called La Guerra di Rapido Corso, War of Rapid Course. The doctrine is also referred to as the War of Rapid Decision, depending on interpretation. This change in hindsight came too late. Tank designs were focused on smaller, cheaper tanks, easier to produce and less materials required. They were not equipped for use as a breakthrough tank that could lead attacks and stand up to enemy armour that the new doctrine required. In 1937, a design was put forward by Fiat-Ansaldo for a medium tank, the M1139. The M1139's design was outdated, based on old armoured doctrine, tanks that were ideal for mountainous terrain and policing. It lacked firepower, with only a 37mm Vickers-Turney gun. It featured a turret, but this only housed machine guns, not capable of penetrating a tank's armour. The Regio Esercito gave it the green light for production. Why? There were simply no other designs to consider, and it fitted the pre-war requirements for European mountainous theatres. It wasn't long before another design was submitted by Fiat-Ansaldo, the M1340. It is around 1938 that the Circolare Numero 3305 is issued by the Regio Esercito's High Command, setting out the requirements for medium tanks. It is also an important document as it changes the designation system. This recognised the classification of light tanks, medium tanks and heavy tanks. The M1340 design appeared promising, but there were still problems with this tank too. However, a decision was made to cancel the production of more M1139 tanks in late 1939. Around 96 of the tanks had been built. The Regio Esercito had to place its faith in the M1340 as there were no other designs to replace the flawed M11 tank. The only other tank considered for production was an M6 prototype, which became the L640, just a light tank. It is around this point of time that there is a change in Chief of Staff. Pariani has already written to Fiat-Ansaldo about his concerns for the M1139 and decided to cancel the production in agreement with Mussolini and go ahead with production for the M1340. Fiat-Ansaldo write back to him, informing him of difficulties producing steel for the tank's armour. Pariani resigns in late 1939, after his reforms and reports to Mussolini. He is replaced by Graziani. Graziani is immediately aware that the production has not started on the M1340 and there are not enough tanks rolling out of the Ansaldo factory. In 1938, during the production of the M1139, a project to build a heavy tank was initiated, the Carro Pesante. It would take around 5 years before this tank would eventually see service, eventually designated as the Carro Armato P40. The tank's design and development was not helped by the shifting and changing of the Regio Esercito's tank requirements. The Regio Esercito never even got to use the tank, as it fell into the hands of the Germans in 1943. Along with problems in tank development aligned to armoured doctrine for the Regio Esercito leading up to and during the war, there was also the inter-service rivalry where the army had to compete with the Air Force and Navy for resources. The Regio Esercito suffered from the lack of unified command. However, there is another failing that we must look at in detail. During the development of the medium tanks in the build-up to the war in North Africa, the Regio Esercito did not have a wide choice of designs to equip the army with tanks. Fiat-Ansaldo, while hampered by the lack of raw materials, also had its own interests that would impact innovation, quality of armour, and the number of tanks built. Before producing this video presentation, I only thought of Fiat-Ansaldo as a partnership in tank building that simply lacked the materials and construction methods to build capable tanks. The reality is far more nuanced, and Fiat-Ansaldo play a much bigger part in why the tank crews had insufficient armour and firepower in the deserts of North Africa. Fiat-Ansaldo were able to create a duopoly. These two manufacturing firms would oversee all tank building during World War II, using smaller companies only for manufacturing components and parts for final assembly at the Ansaldo plant in Genoa. They gave promises to the Regio Esercito and stayed in favour with Mussolini. Fiat-Ansaldo managed to convince General Staff that they could meet a quota. A claim by the head of Ansaldo, Agostino Rocca, was for 25 M13 tanks to be built per month, with an increase by 50% if the Ansaldo plant could be expanded. However, there were problems with the manufacturing of M13 tanks, which began in late 1939. The Superior Inspector of Technical Services, who oversaw the standards of the Italian medium tanks, General Mario Caracciolo, was not happy with the production of the tanks. The first tank had been built, and yet General Caracciolo had found that the various committees, different parties involved in the project, possibly Reggio Esercito, the vehicle advisors at Centro Studi Motorizzazione and Ansaldo engineers, were submitting comments and setting new requirements. Tank production was not moving forward quick enough. Caracciolo urgently requested that the tank be adopted into service, but admitted that the tank was not perfect. There were faults. It was adopted into service in January 1940. As production continued through 1940, accusations are circulated by the Ministry of War about the head of Ansaldo, Agostino Rocca. He is accused of being a merchant and not an industrial patriot. Throughout the course of the war, General Staff, Ministry of War, military leadership all expressed concerns about Fiat-Ansaldo, concerns about the lack of designs, the quality of steel and construction, and the number of tanks produced. Before researching information for this video, I was wondering why didn't the Reggio Esercito enforce the production of tanks at the factories of other manufacturers and alleviate pressure on Fiat-Ansaldo to produce enough tanks? Why did they not encourage other engineering firms to submit tank designs? There is a lack of innovation when it is needed most, during a time of war spreading across continents. We have to take a look at the heads of the two companies that form this duopoly to find out why Fiat-Ansaldo remained in favour and managed to stop competitors building tanks for the Italian army. First, the founder and head of Fiat, Giovanni Agnelli. He was one of the leading Italian industrialists of the time. He became a supporter of Benito Mussolini in the 1920s and was named a senator of the fascist regime by Mussolini in 1923. Agnelli not only supported but funded Mussolini's National Fascist Party. The fascist regime, in return, suppressed workers' movements that threatened industrial profits. Ansaldo was bought out by a holding company, Istituto per la Ricostruzione Industriale, IRI, in the early 1920s. The previous owners, the Peroni family, abandoned the company after a financial crisis. IRI was a company formed by the fascist regime. Mussolini was looking to pump funds into failing companies, trying to stimulate the economy, which had been weakened after World War I. Ansaldo was one of the companies. Agostino Rocca, after studying engineering and building experience and ideas, joined the IRI as a financial advisor when it was founded. He becomes Chief Executive Officer of Ansaldo after the takeover. So both Fiat and Ansaldo effectively became the major industrial partners of Mussolini's regime. Mussolini and the High Command, who have a firm allegiance to fascism, placed their trust in the Fiat-Ansaldo duopoly. You could say misplaced trust. Ansaldo's factory plant in Genoa would be used for final assembly of the tanks. Fiat's plant in Turin would be used to manufacture engines and other components. Fiat would work jointly with Ansaldo to manage the tank development projects. As the war progressed and it became evident that new designs and more tanks were required, Fiat-Ansaldo were questioned by the Reggio Esercito and General Staff. Other companies were under consideration to build tanks. One of them was Otto Malada, and the company had shown interest. There was also potential competition for designs from Germany. Hitler had offered licenses for the Panzer III, Panzer IV and the Panzer V Panther tank to Italy. Fiat-Ansaldo used their fascist allegiance to their advantage, writing persuasive letters to General Staff. I have not seen evidence of these letters, but it is commonly stated by historians, scholars, historical publications and websites that Fiat-Ansaldo were writing letters of communication to High Command. I have seen evidence of regular letters of communication from Agostino Rocca sent to military leadership and technical advisors during the production of tanks, letters sent back and forth making decisions on production and highlighting issues and problems. So it is highly likely letters were written giving reasons why Fiat-Ansaldo should remain as the manufacturer for the Army's tanks. Fiat-Ansaldo are able to use their production history to back their claims that they are the only companies that can build tanks on a national scale. No other manufacturer can produce the number of tanks that they can. Ansaldo provide reports on tanks produced per month meeting agreed quotas. They also submit designs during the project for the Caddo P, which eventually becomes the Caddo Amato P40. This included designs for future heavy tanks, the P43 and P43 bis. These communications are all promises during the war. This successfully persuades High Command to abandon the idea of manufacturing German tanks, which also would have taken too long to set up new production lines. The licenses offered by Hitler are rejected. The Fiat-Ansaldo duopoly provides many problems for the Regio Esercito during the war, which has an impact on the brutal events during the North African campaign. Fiat-Ansaldo's success at stifling the competition led to a lack of innovation. There were very few designs, and the tank designs that went into production were outdated. The M1139 was obviously outdated based on armoured Doctrine nearly a decade back when the L3 tankettes were produced, but even the M1340 was not what the Regio Esercito were calling for. It was not ideal as a breakthrough tank. The tank had thin armour, only 30mm of frontal armour. The 47mm cannon was okay when first deployed in North Africa, but not considered powerful for its time, and the tank featured a lot of machine guns. Mobility was okay, but not as good as some of the Allied tanks in North Africa, notably the cruiser tanks. It was an all-purpose tank, one ideal as a support tank for the infantry. Had other engineering firms like Otto Malala been called upon to build tanks, new designs would have been put forward and they may have been more suitable. We have to look at the role Agostino Rocca, the head of Ansaldo, has to play in all of this. Rocca had a background in engineering and also had military experience as a soldier. But he was also experienced in finance, having been a financial advisor at the holding company IRI. He has a head for figures and he is entrepreneurial. Like all businessmen and women who own or hold a company, they are focused on the bottom line, profits. Large companies tend to prioritise profits over the quality of their product and service in many cases. We see it to this day. Cost cutting is a common practice to achieve higher profit margins. I mentioned earlier a reason why the L3 tankettes suited the Italians during the early 1930s was that they were cheap to produce. They did not require heavy armour and therefore less steel is required. Producing thick enough armour of decent quality remained a problem throughout the tank production under Ansaldo during World War II. A lack of raw materials is a contributing factor to the steel available. But I also believe that Ansaldo will be keeping an eye on the costs. Steel chosen would be of poor quality and thin, keeping costs down and spreading resources across further production. There is also evidence of poor standardization. I mentioned that General Caracciolo ordered for the M1340 tank to enter service despite finding faults. This hints that there were problems with the production standards. Fiat-Ansaldo were under pressure to meet the quota of tanks per month for the Regio Esercito. That means the factory workers are under pressure. They didn't have fancy machines, automation and robots like we see today. Everything is done by hand and with hand tools. Although there were Ansaldo's engineers and military technical advisors overseeing the work, I would imagine the workers cutting corners to get the work done quicker. I believe in that environment and production schedule, there wasn't the time to implement strict quality control. I am under the impression, looking at communications between military technical staff and Rocco, that strict quality control is not in place at the Ansaldo plant. Cost cutting and time constraints is also a reason for the bolted construction methods used to build the tanks. The reason why the Italians did not use welding was because of the low quality steel. It is a difficult challenge to use safe welding when the steel is poor. There is a chance that the steel will crack if it is brittle. It also takes more time to construct the tanks using this method than bolting. Therefore, due to the pressure to meet the quota and poor quality steel used, bolting was the method chosen. Bolted construction may also have been chosen for ease of repair and maintenance. Many viewers on this channel have highlighted this, but the main reasons are time constraints and the quality of steel they had to work with. I think we should take a look at the impact that armour and construction would have on the brave tankers operating the Italian tanks during World War II. Here are some pictures which are distressing. We begin with this photograph, an Italian medium tank, once the pride of its battalion, now savaged by battle. Here a gaping shell hole mars the hull's 30mm thick armour. Spidery cracks radiate from the wound, betraying how the steel, meant to protect, instead shatters like pottery under the force of modern anti-tank rounds. Italian industry during the war, starved for quality steel and time, furnished brittle armour. It snaps and splinters, offering little more than an illusion of safety. Now I move to the next image, a tank wreck slumping in the sand, its turret having buckled deep into the hull. The bolts, meant as anchors, now rendered deadly projectiles. When these tanks were struck, even indirectly, bolt heads would shear off, ricocheting inside the crew compartment like shrapnel, inflicting horrific injuries on anyone within. It would be the same with rivets too. Sometimes a well-placed blast would wrench an entire turret almost through the hull, a macabre testimony to structural weakness. The following picture is harrowing in its completeness. No turret, no hull, just a scorched mark where a tank once stood. This too is a story woven from inadequate steel and flawed assembly. The thin armour, 30mm at the front and in some places less, was especially vulnerable to British and Commonwealth guns deployed across the North African desert. Hits would ignite the racks of ammunition, barely shielded by thin sheets of metal, almost guaranteeing instant fiery death to the crew. Imagine, as you study these wrecks, inside the men had little warning. A strike on the armour could cause an eruption of fragments, both from splintered steel and airborne bolts, slashing and dismembering in a heartbeat. Turrets could drop or crush downwards, trapping and mangling gunners and commanders within their tight confines. In the worst cases, all that remained were shard fragments, a testament to how a tank, poorly built, is less a shield and more a coffin. Every image here is a silent witness to what happens when doctrine, industry and urgency conspire to cut corners. The Italian M1340s and M1441s, with their brittle armour, bolted shells and thin protection, were death traps, terribly outmatched against the weapons of their time. The photos show what words alone cannot, the human cost of mechanical failure and the true lethal meaning behind phrases like poor armour quality and bolted construction. As we conclude our analysis of Italy's failures to provide capable tanks, it's clear that Italy faced profound challenges that shaped its performance and its legacy. At the heart of Italy's struggle was a chronic shortage of materials and industrial weakness. Key manufacturers like Ansaldo resisted modernisation, producing outdated weapons by hand rather than embracing mass production. The political allegiance of the Fiat-Ansaldo operation was used as an advantage to block competition, but in doing so prevented innovation. This industrial faltering meant Italy's armies lacked sufficient modern tanks, vehicles and weaponry to match their adversaries. Equally important was flawed military doctrine. Stuck in the mindset of the First World War, Italian leaders failed to recognise the new face of warfare, a war dominated by mechanised mobility and firepower. Armoured units were few, underpowered and poorly integrated, while the bulk of the army remained reliant on foot soldiers and horse-drawn supplies, aligned to a theatre of mountainous terrain rather than the harsh environments of North Africa. Strategic leadership was no less problematic. Politicisation and poor decision-making at the top hampered adaptation and innovation. Mussolini's favouritism, mixed with rivalry among the military branches, fractured unity and left Italy's forces ill-prepared for the demands of rapid, mobile combat. Mussolini's propaganda painted a very different picture, one of strength and invincibility, but the reality was grim. Troops, mostly conscripts, were often undertrained, poorly equipped, and sent directly into battle with little preparation. This disconnect was nowhere more evident than in Italy's armoured forces. Their tanks were technologically inferior, lightly armoured, undergunned, and simply outdated. When faced with mechanised opponents, these forces struggled to survive, let alone succeed. The consequences were swift and severe. Campaigns stalled or collapsed in Greece, North Africa, and beyond. Italy's military weaknesses translated into rapid defeats, exposing the fragility of a force unready for the brutal realities of modern war. These failures have cast a long shadow, leaving Italy's army with a reputation for inefficiency and poor leadership, a legacy that historians continue to examine and debate. Italy's experience in World War II is a vivid example of how industrial shortcomings, outdated doctrine, and flawed leadership can combine to undermine even the best intentions on the battlefield. We must understand these lessons from history to help us appreciate the complexities of military power and the vital importance of preparedness in times of conflict.